Captain Jake Morrison felt small as he walked through the massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber. The ceiling stretched so high above him that he could barely see it. The walls were made of some kind of crystal that seemed to glow with its own light. Everything here was built to make visitors feel tiny and unimportant. Jake had been to Nexus Station many times before, but never to this room. This was where the real decisions were made. This was where the fate of entire worlds was decided by beings so old and powerful that they thought of species like humans as children. He wore his best uniform, the dark blue of Earth's space service. The silver stars on his shoulders marked him as a captain, but here those stars meant nothing. Here he was just another representative from a young species that had barely learned to leave their home planet. The chamber was filling up with representatives from across the galaxy. Jake recognized some of them from his studies. There was Ambassador Kreeth from the Wanderer clans, a tall being with 4 arms and skin like bark. Near the back sat the silent observers from the synthesis worlds, their faces hidden behind masks that glowed with soft blue light. But Jake's attention was drawn to the center of the chamber where the real power sat. The 3 seats of the major galactic powers rose above all the others like thrones. High Counselor Zixtar of the Zephyrians floated in what looked like a bubble of golden light. The Zephyrians were energy beings, older than most stars. They spoke in voices that sounded like wind chimes and thought of solid matter as crude and temporary. Zixtar had been alive when Jake's sun was still forming. Next to the Zephyrian sat the speaker for the collective. Jake could never tell if he was looking at one being or many. The collective was a hive mind that spanned dozens of worlds. The speaker's body shifted and changed as different parts of the collective took control. Sometimes it looked almost human, sometimes like something from Earth's deepest oceans. The third throne held Lord Commander Vorthak of the Empire that bore his species' name. The Vorthaks looked like they were carved from black stone, with eyes like burning coals. They were warriors and conquerors who had ruled their part of the galaxy for thousands of years. Lord Commander Vorthak was said to have personally destroyed 7 civilizations that had dared to challenge his empire. Jake took his assigned seat in the lower section, where the younger species sat. Around him were representatives from worlds that had joined the galactic community in the last few hundred years. They all looked nervous. They all knew that when the major powers called a special session, it usually meant bad news for someone. A soft chime filled the chamber, and all conversation stopped. High Counselor Zixtar's voice floated through the air like music, but there was something cold in it that made Jake's skin crawl. "We gather today to address a matter of galactic security," Zixtar said. "The species known as humans have been part of our community for 15 of their years. In that time, they have shown remarkable expansion and adaptation." Jake felt his heart begin to beat faster. This was about humanity. This was about his people. The collective's speaker shifted, its form becoming more solid. When it spoke, its voice was like many people talking at once. "The humans come from what they call Earth, a death world of extreme conditions. Most species require protective equipment to survive on their planet. This has made them unusually hardy and aggressive." Lord Commander Vorthak leaned forward on his throne. His voice was like grinding stone. "In 15 years, they have established colonies on 12 worlds. Most species take centuries to achieve such expansion. They adapt to environments that would kill others. They solve problems through methods that disturb the natural order." Jake wanted to stand up and defend his people, but he knew better. This was not a debate. This was a judgment. Zixtar continued, "The humans have shown concerning independence. They question established procedures. They refuse to accept limitations that other species have accepted for millennia. Their very nature as Deathworlders makes them unpredictable and potentially dangerous." The chamber was completely silent now. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Every representative in the room was looking at him, the lone human, among hundreds of alien beings. "Therefore," Zixtar announced, "the High Council has prepared the limitation decree for the human species." A holographic document appeared in the air above Jake's seat. The words were translated into English, but they might as well have been written in fire. Jake read them once, Then again, unable to believe what he was seeing. The decree was simple and devastating. Humanity would immediately cease all colonization beyond their current 12 worlds. They would submit to genetic modification to reduce their physical capabilities to galactic standard levels. They would accept permanent monitoring stations in all human systems. They would limit their population growth and submit detailed reports on all technological development. In short, humanity would become a controlled species, limited and watched like dangerous animals in a zoo. Jake's hands shook as he held the holographic display. Around him, other representatives watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief. Sympathy because they felt sorry for the humans. Relief because it was not their species being limited today. Captain Morrison. Zixtar's voice carried clearly across the vast chamber. You will return to your people with this decree. You have 72 of your hours to return with your species' formal acceptance. The terms are not negotiable. Jake stood slowly, his legs feeling weak. He looked up at the three powers who had just decided the fate of his entire species. They stared back at him with the confidence of beings who had never been told no. I understand, Jake said, his voice barely carrying in the huge space. 72 hours. He turned and walked toward the massive doors, carrying with him the document that would chain his people forever. Behind him, the representatives began to whisper among themselves, already moving on to other business. As Jake stepped out of the chamber, he realized that everything had changed. The galaxy that humanity had worked so hard to join had just told them they were too dangerous to be free. The question now was what his people would do about it. The doors closed behind him with a sound like thunder, and Jake began the long journey home with news that would shake the foundations of human space. The emergency meeting of the United Earth Council had been going on for 6 hours. Jake Morrison sat at the witness table, watching humanity's leaders argue about the fate of their species. The holographic display of the limitation decree floated above the center of the room like a dark cloud. Council President Maria Santos paced behind her desk, her face pale with exhaustion. She had called representatives from every human world as soon as Jake's ship had arrived. Now the council chamber was packed with people who had traveled across space to decide whether humanity would bow to the galaxy's demands. We have to be realistic, said Representative Clark from New Berlin Colony. His voice was tight with fear. We're talking about going against civilizations that are thousands of years old. The Vorthax alone could wipe us out in a week. Admiral Lisa Chen stood near the military section of the chamber. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen too many battles. Representative Clark is right about their military power, she said. Our entire fleet has maybe 200 ships. The Vorthak Empire has over 10,000. The math is simple. Jake watched the faces around the room. He could see the fear there, but also something else. Anger. The kind of deep, burning anger that came when someone told you that you were not allowed to exist as yourself. What about our colonies? Asked Representative Hayes from the mining world of Kepler. Are we supposed to just abandon them? Tell our people to pack up and leave. The homes they built with their own hands? The room fell quiet for a moment. Everyone knew what the colonies meant to humanity. They were proof that humans could survive anywhere, could build something from nothing. Each world had been claimed not through conquest, but through the simple, human ability to live where others could not. Council President Santos activated a communication link to Haven Colony. The face of Colony Administrator Ben Rodriguez appeared on the main screen. His weathered features showed the strain of running a frontier world, but his eyes were steady. Ben, President Santos said, you've heard about the decree. What's the situation out there? Ben's image flickered slightly as the long-distance signal adjusted. President Santos, the people here are scared, but they're also angry. Haven isn't just a colony to us, it's home. We've got families who have been here for 10 years, kids who were born here. This world tried to kill us when we first arrived, but we made it work. Jake had visited Haven once. It was a harsh planet with an atmosphere that would poison most galactic species. The gravity was heavy, the weather was violent, and the native plants were toxic. But humans had not only survived, There they had thrived. They had built cities and farms in places where other species would die in minutes. The colonists are asking questions, Ben continued. They want to know why beings who can't even breathe our air get to decide where we can live. They want to know why we have to change our bodies to make other species comfortable. Admiral Chen stepped forward. Administrator Rodriguez, you need to understand the military reality. If we refuse this decree, they will come for us. Every human world will be a target. Ben's expression hardened. Admiral, with respect, we didn't come to Haven because it was safe. We came here because it was ours. We came here because no one else wanted it or could take it from us. If they want to try, let them come. The communication ended, leaving the council chamber in heavy silence. Jake could see that Ben's words had affected everyone in the room. This was the spirit that had driven humanity to the stars. This was the stubborn refusal to give up that had made them survivors. Representative Williams from Europa Station spoke up. I've been reviewing the decree, she said, her voice careful and measured. The genetic modifications they're demanding would fundamentally change what we are. They want to reduce our physical strength, our endurance, our ability to adapt. They want to make us like them. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, muttered Representative Clark. Maybe being a little less aggressive would help us fit in better. The room erupted. Voices rose from every section as representatives shouted over each other. Some called for immediate acceptance of the decree. Others demanded immediate war. A few suggested trying to negotiate, though everyone knew the Galactic Council had said the terms were not negotiable. President Santos called for order, but the arguing continued. In the chaos, Jake noticed a small group of people sitting in the observer section. They were not politicians or military officers. They were ordinary citizens who had somehow gotten permission to attend. One of them was Amy Walker, a farmer from the agricultural world of Green Valley. She was a young woman with dirt under her fingernails and calluses on her hands from years of working the soil. Next to her sat Tom Santos, an engineer who had helped build the terraforming stations on 3 different worlds. These were the people who actually did the work of human expansion. They were the ones who turned empty planets into homes. They were the ones who would suffer most if humanity accepted the limitations. Amy Walker stood up suddenly, her voice cutting through the argument. "Excuse me," she said, and something in her tone made the entire room fall silent. President Santos looked surprised but nodded for Amy to continue. "I'm just a farmer," Amy said, "but I want to say something. My family has been growing food on Green Valley for 8 years. We started with nothing but seeds and hope. We worked 18-hour days to make that planet feed people. We did it because someone had to, and because we could." She paused, looking around the room at all the powerful people who were deciding her fate. "Now you're telling me that we did too good a job, that we're too successful, too adaptable, too strong, that we need to change ourselves to make other people comfortable." Amy's voice grew stronger. "Well, I have news for all of you. I am not broken, and I do not need to be fixed." Tom Santos stood up beside her. "Amy's right," he said. "We built our colonies in places where other species can't go. We didn't take anyone's land or hurt anyone. We just found places that were empty and made them into something. If that makes us dangerous, then maybe the problem isn't with us." More people in the observer section began to stand. Soon half the room was on their feet, and Jake could see something happening. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by something stronger. Determination. President Santos looked around the room at the standing citizens, then at the seated politicians. Her face showed that she understood what was happening. This was not just about military strategy or diplomatic negotiations. This was about who humanity was going to be. "Captain Morrison," she said, turning to Jake, "in 48 hours you have to return to the Galactic Council with our answer. What do you think we should tell them?" Jake stood slowly, feeling the weight of his entire species on his shoulders. He thought about High Counselor Zixtar's cold voice, about Lord Commander Forthak's burning eyes, about the collective's many faces. He thought about the massive chamber designed to make visitors feel small and powerless. Then he thought about Amy Walker's dirty hands and Tom Santos's determined face. He thought about Ben Rodriguez and the colonists of Haven, who had turned a poison world into a home. He thought about all the humans who had looked at impossible situations and said, "We can do this." "I think," Jake said quietly, "that we need to decide what kind of species we want to be. Do we want to be the kind that gives up when things get hard? Or do we want to be the kind that stands up for what's right, even when it's dangerous?" The room was completely silent now. Everyone was looking at Jake, waiting for him to continue. "Because I'll tell you what I learned in that council chamber," Jake said, his voice growing stronger. "They're not afraid of our ships or our weapons. They're afraid of our spirit. They're afraid that if they let us stay free, other species might start asking why they can't be free too." Jake looked around the room one more time, seeing his people's faces in the light of the holographic decree that still floated above them. "So, the question is," he said, "are we going to let them be afraid? Or are we going to show them that freedom is worth fighting for?" Jake Morrison's hands were steady as he walked through the doors of the Galactic Council chamber for the second time in 3 days. This time felt different. The massive room seemed just as big, the crystal walls just as bright. But Jake no longer felt small. The chamber was more crowded than before. Word had spread across the galaxy that the humans were returning with their answer to the limitation decree. Representatives from dozens of species had come to watch what everyone expected would be humanity's surrender. Jake could see Ambassador Kreeth from the Wanderer clan sitting forward in his seat, his forearms folded across his chest. The masked observers from the synthesis worlds had moved closer to the front. Even species that rarely attended council meetings had sent representatives to witness this moment. At the center of it all, the 3 major powers waited on their raised thrones. High Counselor Zixtar floated in his bubble of golden light, looking like a distant star. The collective's speaker sat perfectly still, its form more solid than usual, as if every part of the hive mind was focused on this moment. Lord Commander Vorthak leaned back in his black throne, his burning eyes fixed on Jake with the patience of a predator. As Jake walked to his assigned seat, he noticed something he had missed before. Many of the smaller species representatives looked nervous, but not just about what the humans would do. They looked like people who were afraid of what might happen to them if they were seen supporting the wrong side. Jake had spent the last 72 hours thinking about that, about how the galaxy worked, about who really had power and who just pretended to, about fear and freedom and the price of both. The soft chime that called the session to order rang through the chamber. High Counselor Zixtar's voice drifted down from above like wind through empty spaces. "Captain Morrison of the human species," Zixtar said, "you have returned as promised. The Galactic Council awaits your people's formal acceptance of the limitation decree." Jake stood slowly. Around him, hundreds of beings from across the galaxy leaned forward to hear humanity's surrender. In the viewing galleries, news reporters from dozens of worlds prepared to broadcast the moment when another young species learned their place in the galactic order. The chamber fell completely silent. Jake could hear his own breathing, his own heartbeat. Somewhere in the back of the room, he heard the soft whisper of someone adjusting their position to get a better view. Jake looked up at High Counselor Zixtar, then at the speaker for the collective, then at Lord Commander Vorthak. These beings had lived for thousands of years. They had seen civilizations rise and fall. They had watched countless species bow to their will. Jake took a deep breath and spoke one word that echoed through the vast chamber and across every communication channel broadcasting to the galaxy. "No." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake wondered if time itself had stopped. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Then the chamber exploded into chaos. Representatives jumped to their feet, shouting in dozens of languages. The news reporters frantically adjusted their equipment, unable to believe what they had just heard. In the viewing galleries, beings who had never seen anyone refuse a High Council decree stared in shock. But Jake kept talking, his voice carrying clearly through the noise. "Humanity rejects the limitation decree," he said. "We will not submit to genetic modification. We will not abandon our colonies. We will not accept limits on our growth or our freedom." High Counselor Zixtar's golden light flared brighter, and his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Captain Morrison, no species in galactic history has ever refused a High Council decree. You do not understand what you are doing. Jake looked directly at the ancient being floating above him. I understand perfectly, he said. You want us to change who we are because you're afraid of who we might become. The collective speaker rose from its throne, its form shifting and changing as different parts of the hive mind fought for control. When it spoke, its voice was like a crowd shouting. The humans are too dangerous to remain unrestricted. They expand too quickly. They adapt too easily. They question too much. Yes, Jake said simply. We do. Lord Commander Vorthak leaned forward, his stone face showing the first emotion Jake had ever seen from him. It was anger, but also something else. Surprise. You would choose war over wisdom? Vorthak asked, his voice like grinding rocks. You would sacrifice your entire species rather than accept reasonable limits? Jake felt the weight of every eye in the chamber on him. This was the moment that would decide everything. Not just for humanity, but for every species watching. For every being who had ever wondered if they had to accept the limits others placed on them. We would choose freedom over safety, Jake said. We would choose to remain human, rather than become something else to make you comfortable. And yes, if that means war, then we choose war. The chamber erupted again, but this time Jake could hear something different in the voices. Fear, yes, but also excitement. Whispers in languages he did not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Some of these beings were impressed. High Counselor Zixtar raised his hand and the chamber gradually fell quiet. His golden light pulsed with what Jake thought might be anger. Very well, Zixtar said. If humanity chooses to defy the natural order, then humanity will face the consequences. The Galactic Council declares the human species to be in violation of cosmic law. All member species are hereby authorized to take whatever action they deem necessary to contain the human threat. Jake nodded. He had expected this. We understand, he said. But before you send your fleets to destroy us, ask yourself something. If humans are so dangerous that you need to limit us, what makes you think you can defeat us in war? The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake could see doubt flickering across some faces in the crowd. The major powers had spent so much time talking about how dangerous humans were that they had convinced everyone, including themselves. We have ruled this galaxy for millennia, Lord Commander Vorthak said. But Jake heard something new in his voice. Uncertainty. You have ruled species that accepted your rule, Jake replied. You have never fought a species that came from a death world. You have never fought people who would rather die free than live as slaves. Jake began walking toward the chamber doors, but he turned back for one final statement. We know we might lose, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. We know you have more ships, more weapons, more time. But we also know something you have forgotten. Freedom is not something you can give or take away by decree. It lives in the heart of every thinking being. And once that spark is lit, it spreads. Jake looked out at the hundreds of representatives from smaller species, beings whose worlds had accepted limitation after limitation over the centuries. Some of you remember what it felt like to be free, Jake said. Some of you remember making your own choices about your own worlds. Ask yourselves if you are happier now, limited and safe, or if there is something missing from your lives. He turned to leave, but Ambassador Kreeth from the Wanderer clan suddenly stood up. His forearms spread wide and his bark-like skin seemed to shimmer in the chamber's light. Captain Morrison, Kreeth called out, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. The Wanderer clans have not forgotten what freedom means. The chamber fell deadly quiet. Everyone stared at the tall alien who had just spoken words that sounded dangerously close to support for the humans. High Counselor Zixtar's light flared again. Ambassador Kreeth, you will remember your place. But other voices began to rise from the crowd. A representative from the synthesis worlds removed her glowing mask, showing her face for the first time in decades. We too remember, she said, quietly. More beings began to stand. Not many, but enough to send a ripple of shock through the major powers section. These were species that had been quiet and obedient for centuries, suddenly finding their voices. Jake felt something he had not expected: hope. "The Galactic Council is dismissed," Zixtar announced quickly, clearly wanting to end the session before more species could speak up. "All representatives will return to their worlds and prepare for the restoration of order." As beings began filing out of the chamber, Jake walked toward the doors with steady steps. Behind him, he could hear whispered conversations in dozens of languages. The word "no" was being repeated in many different tongues, as if people were testing how it felt to say it. At the doorway, Jake paused and looked back one more time. The three major powers sat on their thrones, no longer looking like distant gods, but like very worried rulers whose authority had just been questioned for the first time in thousands of years. Jake smiled and walked out into the corridor where the real work would begin. The galaxy had heard humanity's answer. Now they would see what humans could do when they fought for something that mattered. The word "no" continued to echo through the chamber long after Jake had gone, and for the first time in galactic history, it sounded like the beginning of something rather than the end. 3 weeks after Jake Morrison said no to the galaxy, the war began. Admiral Lisa Chen stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Liberty, watching the sensor displays that showed incoming enemy fleets. The Vorthak Empire had sent 50 warships to Earth's solar system. It was just the beginning. "Admiral," reported Lieutenant Davis from the communications station, "we're getting reports from all our colonies. The collective is moving against New Tokyo. The Zephyrians are blockading the trade routes to Green Valley. It's coordinated." Lisa nodded grimly. She had expected this. The major powers were not going to let humanity's defiance go unanswered. They were going to make an example of the humans that would keep other species in line for another 1,000 years. "Send the signal to all colonies," Lisa ordered. "Execute Plan Freedom." Plan Freedom was not really a plan for victory. Lisa knew they could not win a straight fight against the galactic powers. Instead, it was a plan for survival, and maybe something more important than that. On the colony world of Haven, Ben Rodriguez received the signal in his underground command center. Above him, the first collective ships were entering orbit. Through the thick windows, he could see the poison clouds that made Haven's atmosphere deadly to most galactic species. "All civilians to the deep shelters," Ben ordered his staff. "Military personnel to defensive positions. Remember, they cannot breathe our air without suits. We can." The first landing ships from the collective broke through Haven's atmosphere an hour later. They were filled with soldiers from a dozen different species, all wearing environmental suits to protect them from the toxic air. They landed near the main settlement, expecting to find frightened colonists ready to surrender. Instead, they found empty buildings and silent streets. Amy Walker crouched in a tunnel beneath her farm, listening to the heavy footsteps of alien soldiers walking above her. She had spent 8 years learning every inch of this land. She knew where the ground was soft, where the native plants were most dangerous, where the morning mists would hide a person from sensors. The collective soldiers were good fighters, but they were fighting on a world that was actively trying to kill them. Every breath they took had to be filtered. Every step had to be carefully planned to avoid the acid pools that looked like ordinary water. Every piece of equipment had to be protected from the corrosive atmosphere. Meanwhile, Amy and her fellow colonists moved through their tunnels like ghosts. They struck at supply convoys, disabled equipment, and disappeared back into the poison mists. The soldiers could never catch them because the soldiers could not survive without their protective gear, and the gear made them slow and clumsy. On New Tokyo, the story was similar but different. The world was not poisonous like Haven, but it was hot. The surface temperature regularly reached levels that would cook most galactic species. The human colonists had built their cities underground and in the polar regions, but they could work on the surface when they needed to. Engineer Tom Santos led a team of saboteurs across the burning desert, moving only during the hottest part of the day when the collective's sensors could not distinguish their heat signatures from the background temperature. They attacked the enemy's cooling systems, knowing that without them, the alien soldiers would have to retreat to orbit. "Tom," radioed his teammate Maria, The enemy is pulling back to their ships again. That's the third time this week. Tom smiled as he watched the collective transports fleeing back to space. They came here expecting to fight humans, he said. They did not expect to fight the world itself. But the war was not just being fought on the colony worlds. In space, Admiral Lisa Chen was learning that humans fought differently there too. The Vorthak fleet had expected the human ships to meet them in traditional battle formation. Instead, the human ships scattered like seeds in the wind. They used the asteroid belt around Earth's sun to hide and strike. They attacked supply lines instead of warships. They fought like pirates instead of soldiers. "Admiral," reported Captain Jones from the destroyer Swift Arrow, "we just hit another Vorthak supply convoy. They are starting to keep their cargo ships in the inner system where we cannot reach them easily." Lisa studied the tactical display. The enemy had more ships and bigger guns, but they also had something humans did not have. They had an empire to protect. Every ship they sent to fight humans was a ship that could not patrol their own borders or protect their own trade routes. "Captain Jones," Lisa said, "send small teams to hit targets in Vorthak space. Nothing big, just enough to make them worry about their home worlds." The strategy was working. Reports were coming in from across the galaxy that the major powers were struggling to contain the human threat. But more importantly, other species were beginning to act. On Nexus Station, Ambassador Kreith met secretly with representatives from the synthesis worlds and half a dozen smaller species. They gathered in a maintenance tunnel deep in the station's infrastructure, far from the listening devices of the major powers. "The humans have shown us something," Kreith said, his forearms gesturing in the dim light. "They have shown us that the major powers can be resisted." Representative Yara from the synthesis worlds removed her mask completely, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "My people have been hiding behind these masks for 300 years, she said. "The Zephyrians told us our faces were too disturbing for polite galactic society. We accepted this because we were afraid." "What are you proposing?" asked Ambassador Chen from the Outer Rim Coalition, a small alliance of mining worlds. Kreith looked around the circle of faces, beings from species that had been ignored and limited for centuries. "I am proposing that we remember what the humans said. Freedom is not something that can be given or taken by decree. It lives in the heart of every thinking being." As the secret meeting continued, across the galaxy the war was spreading in ways the major powers had not expected. Human raids were hitting targets throughout Vorthak space. The collective was losing ships to the poison worlds they could not properly assault. The Zephyrians were discovering that blockading human trade routes also meant blockading the routes used by dozens of other species. On Earth, Jake Morrison sat in a communications center deep beneath the planet's surface, coordinating the resistance. Reports flowed in from every front, and while the news was not all good, it was not all bad either. "Captain Morrison," said Communications Officer Brooks, "we just received a message from the Wanderer clans. They are refusing to pay tribute to the Vorthak Empire. They say they are inspired by humanity's example." Jake felt a spark of something he had not dared to feel before. Not hope for victory, but hope for something bigger. Hope that humanity's no was becoming the galaxy's no. More reports came in. The synthesis worlds were demanding representation on the Galactic Council. 3 minor species had declared independence from collective oversight. Trade routes were being disrupted as smaller species refused to carry goods for the major powers. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Wang, "Admiral Chen wants to speak with you. She says it's urgent." Lisa's face appeared on the main screen, her expression serious but not defeated. "Jake," she said, "the enemy is regrouping. They are pulling ships back from their borders to concentrate on us. We estimate they will have over 300 ships in human space within 2 weeks." Jake nodded. This was what they had expected. Eventually, the major powers would commit everything to crushing the human rebellion before it spread further. "Are we ready?" Jake asked. Lisa smiled, and for the first time in weeks it looked genuine. "We are as ready as we can be. But Jake, it is not just about us anymore. The entire galaxy is watching. If we can hold out long enough, if we can show that the major powers are not invincible, then maybe other species will find the courage to stand up too. Jake thought about that. About all the beings across the galaxy who had lived their entire lives accepting limits placed on them by others. About species that had forgotten they had ever been free. About the choice between safety and dignity that every thinking being eventually had to make. Then we hold, Jake said simply. Whatever it costs, we hold. As the communication ended, Jake looked around the command center at the faces of his people. They were scared, but they were determined. They had chosen to say no to the most powerful forces in the galaxy, and they were going to keep saying it until the galaxy changed or they were all dead. Outside, in the cold space between the stars, the largest fleet in galactic history was gathering to crush a single species that had dared to refuse their place. But that species was not backing down, and across the galaxy, other voices were beginning to whisper the word that had started it all. No. 6 months after Jake Morrison first said no to the galaxy, he stood once again in the Galactic Council chamber. But this time, everything was different. The massive room was still the same size. The crystal walls still glowed with their own light. But the chamber no longer felt like a place designed to make visitors feel small. Today it felt like what it was supposed to be. A place where equals came to talk. The war had raged across dozens of worlds, but it had not ended the way anyone expected. The major powers had won many battles, but they had not won the war. More importantly, they had not won the peace. While human colonies fought desperately against invasion fleets, something else had been happening across the galaxy. Other species had been watching, and they had been learning. The Wanderer clans had stopped paying tribute to the Vorthak Empire. When Vorthak ships came to force payment, they found empty worlds. The nomadic clans had simply moved deeper into space, beyond the reach of imperial fleets. They sent a simple message. We will return when we are treated as equals, not subjects. The synthesis worlds had done something even more dramatic. They had removed their masks and shown their faces to the galaxy for the first time in 3 centuries. When the Zephyrians demanded they cover themselves again, the entire species had simply said no. Their representative Yara had spoken words that traveled across every communication network. We are beautiful as we are. We will not hide anymore. Dozens of smaller species had followed their example. The Outer Rim Coalition had declared independence. The mining guilds had formed their own government. 3 species had quit the Galactic Council entirely, rather than accept continued limitations on their sovereignty. The major powers still had bigger fleets and more advanced weapons, but they no longer had unquestioned authority. Every decree they issued was now debated, questioned, and sometimes simply ignored. Jake walked to the center of the chamber, but not to the small section where younger species had always been forced to sit. Today he walked to a new section that had been built during the long months of negotiations. It was for species that demanded to be treated as equals. Around him sat representatives from 50 worlds that had joined what the galaxy was calling the Freedom Coalition. Ambassador Kreeth was there, representing the Wanderer clans. Representative Yara sat with her face uncovered, speaking for the synthesis worlds. Even some species that had once been part of the major empires had sent representatives. At the center of the chamber, the 3 thrones of the major powers looked smaller than they used to. High Counselor Zixtar still floated in his bubble of golden light, but the light seemed dimmer. The collective's speaker still shifted and changed, but less confidently. Lord Commander Vorthak still sat on his black throne, but his burning eyes no longer seemed so frightening. The war had cost them all. The Vorthak Empire was dealing with rebellions on a dozen worlds. The collective had lost entire sectors to independence movements. The Zephyrians had discovered that their ancient authority meant nothing when people simply refused to obey. President Maria Santos of Earth sat beside Jake, no longer as a representative of a junior species but as the leader of a government that had earned its place through struggle. Admiral Lisa Chen stood behind them, wearing the uniform of a military that had held off the largest invasion fleet in galactic history. High Counselor Zixtar's voice drifted through the chamber, but it no longer carried the absolute authority it once had. We gathered today to discuss the new arrangements. that seemed to have developed across the galaxy. Jake stood and the chamber fell quiet. But it was not the tense silence of fear that had filled the room 6 months ago. It was the respectful quiet given to someone who had earned the right to speak. "High Counselor," Jake said, "we are here to establish a new galactic charter, one based on the sovereign rights of all species, not the dominance of a few. The old order has maintained peace for thousands of years," Lord Commander Vorthak said, his stone voice carrying less conviction than before. "The old order maintained control," replied Representative Yara, her uncovered face showing emotions that had been hidden for centuries. "Peace built on fear and submission is not real peace." Ambassador. Kreeth rose to his full height, his forearms spread wide. "The Wanderer clans have lived free in the void for 6 months. We have had no wars, no conflicts, no need for the protection you claim to provide. We have proven that species can govern themselves." The debate that followed was unlike anything the Galactic Council had ever seen. For the first time in millennia, the major powers were not dictating terms. They were negotiating. The collective speaker tried to argue that some species needed guidance, that freedom without limits led to chaos. But species after species stood to challenge that claim. They spoke of worlds that had governed themselves successfully, of problems solved through cooperation rather than control, of progress made through choice rather than decree. Jake listened to the voices of dozens of species finding their courage, and he thought about Amy Walker and Tom Santos, and Ben Rodriguez and all the other humans who had refused to accept limits on who they could be. Their example had lit a fire that was now burning across the galaxy. "The question," Jake said when the debate finally quieted, "is not whether species can be trusted with freedom. The question is whether anyone has the right to take that freedom away." High Counselor Zixtar's light pulsed slowly. "And if we refuse to accept these new arrangements? If we choose to maintain the old order?" The chamber fell silent again. But this time Jake could feel the strength of 50 united species behind him. "Then you will rule over empty space," Jake said simply, "because we will not be ruled anymore." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The galaxy had learned that there were alternatives to submission. Entire species had already chosen exile over limitation. Others had chosen resistance over compliance. The major powers could try to maintain control through force, but they would be fighting the entire galaxy. The negotiations continued for 3 more days. In the end, a new charter was written. It recognized the sovereign rights of all species to govern themselves. It limited the power of the Galactic Council to matters that affected multiple species. It established that no species could be forced to change their fundamental nature to satisfy others. Most importantly, it enshrined the principle that Jake Morrison had spoken 6 months before. Freedom was not something that could be granted or taken away by decree, but something that lived in the heart of every thinking being. The charter was not perfect. There were compromises and exceptions, clauses that would need to be refined over time. But it was a beginning. As Jake prepared to leave the chamber for the final time, High Counselor Zixtar spoke to him privately. "Captain Morrison," the ancient being said, "you have changed everything. The galaxy will never be the same." Jake nodded. That was the point, High Counselor. Change was needed. "But at what cost?" Zixtar asked. "The old order provided stability, predictability. Now there will be chaos, uncertainty." Jake thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "High Counselor, humans have a saying, it is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. The galaxy has chosen to stand up. Whatever comes next, we will face it as free beings." As Jake walked out of the chamber, he passed a group of young beings from different species who were touring the station. They were students, he realized, learning about galactic government. One of them, a small creature with large eyes and soft fur, looked up at him curiously. "Are you the human who said no?" she asked in a voice like wind chimes. Jake knelt down, to her level. "I am one of many who said no," he replied. "And now you can say no too if you need to." The young being's eyes grew even wider. "I can?" You can, Jake said. That is what freedom means. The right to say no when someone tries to make you into something you are not. As Jake walked away, he heard the young being practicing the word quietly to herself. No, she whispered, then louder. No. She was learning that the word was not scary. It was powerful. Jake smiled as he headed home to Earth, where Amy Walker was still farming, Tom Santos was still building, and Ben Rodriguez was still turning impossible places into homes. The galaxy had learned an important lesson from humanity, that some things were worth fighting for, and that the most powerful word in any language was still just 2 letters long. Behind him, in the great chamber where the fate of species had once been decided by others, new voices were beginning to speak. Voices that had been silent for centuries were finding their strength. And across the galaxy, the word that had started it all continued to echo, carried by beings who had finally remembered what it meant to be free. The galaxy had fallen silent when Jake Morrison first shouted, "No." Now it was alive with the voices of species who had found their own words, their own courage, their own freedom. And that, Jake thought, was exactly how it should be.